I personally started on the path towards living distributist-ly when I read Walden, this book here that I brought with me today, at around the age of 16. It was my first introduction to sort of living in a more simplified way. My first introduction to Walden actually wasn't through the book, but as a cassette audiobook in the library where I worked. From having a cassette player, it's clear I was already on a sort of path to living in an alternative way. However, this audiobook definitely swerved me in a different direction. So what is Walden about? The synopsis is essentially that Thoreau in 1845 stopped living in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, and moved into a small hut on the edge of Walden Pond. His cabin contained only the essentials: a bed, a writing desk, a table, and 3 chairs. Those for when guests came along from the walking path from the railroad. He also had cooking items like a kettle, skillet, and dishes, a few tools, and basic clothing. His food, his plan was to live deliberately, and everything in the cabin had to have a very specific use. For food, he cultivated beans, which he used to trade and sell. Alongside this, he also hunted for any small game that was in and around the pond. It is also said that his mum did come and bring him sandwiches from time to time, which is omitted from the book. For this bean field, he worked for approximately 6 weeks of the year, and the rest of the time was spent on producing art and observing the local wildlife. And you may be thinking, what does this have to do with distributism? Obviously, Walden predates distributism, being from 1845 and Chesterton and Belloc being from sort of the 1910s and 20s. However, the core message of the book is that self-reliance and minimalism is a preferable way to spend one's life, as opposed to living in what we would now call the rat race. In the first chapter of the book, Thoreau uses wigwams to pose the question of whether modern house ownership, of having a large hearth fire and Venetian blinds all paid by credit, and thereby enslaving the owner, was preferable to the wigwam. He posits that as the wigwam requires less work and hours to upkeep and get in the first place, when compared to the mortgage system that locks you in for 15 years on a modern dwelling, you would have been able to properly live if you chose the wigwam over the house. Another example of this way of thinking is a few paragraphs later, when he remarks about how the local farmers struggle to pay their debts because they buy huge acreages of farmland and they're encumbered with machinery, usually again paid with credit. When if they had chosen to live within a smaller scope and live within their own means, they would not be shackled by the chains they put around their own feet. He says about the farmers, and I quote, "With consummate skill, he has set his trap with a hairspring to catch comfort and independence, and then, as he turned away, got his own leg into it." Living within your means, I would say, is quite key in how I view distributism, especially when it comes to private property. Decentralized property only works if people avoid lifestyles that require massive industrial infrastructure. If we all here lived in a cabin in the woods, where we do 6 weeks of toil in exchange for the rest of the year to pursue our art form or artisanal trade, do you think your life would feel more fulfilling? There's certainly the downside of having to leave a lot of your material comforts behind, but how much would you give up in exchange for full independence? I'm not saying that you have to seclude yourself in the woods. It's noted in the book that Thoreau did venture into Concord multiple times a year, and was also visited by friends and people walking the railroad. I think this question of how much you're willing to give up is key in the first steps to live spiritually distributist. Living simpler is a big component of distributist thinking, and the first steps to living simpler is to remove things in your life that may be weighing down or stopping you from having genuine autonomy over your actions and the way you experience life. I'm not going to lecture you all on what you need to generally remove, as for the most part it's subjective. But for example, I would love to get rid of my phone and replace it with writing letters to communicate. Why letters? Because the act of writing a letter is a deliberate process, taken with care, whereas instant communication is disposable. Stewardship is also brought up in a lot of the more nature-based segments of the book. Thoreau advocates that we should all see ourselves as part of nature, as opposed to the way we separate ourselves and think of ourselves as better or more valuable than nature. Right now, I think a lot of people see us as masters of nature when the opposite is true. Thoreau points this out and says that nature has a one-up on us because nature provides the meaning that technology can't, and is able to teach us to be humble and aware. In a rather crude twist, I believe climate change, or pollution in general, is an extension of this. As we as a species, through the brazen naivety that we are better than nature, may wipe ourselves out as we continue to abuse our natural environment in the pursuit of consumer goods. This section in particular is certainly important, and as a distributist, a healthy connection to nature is imperative. I don't think you suddenly have to become an encyclopedia of natural history to gain some important introspection. However, having a basic insight into how our ecosystem works is a good stepping stone to understanding how you, as an individual, might fit into any given system, and the importance that you have in relation to affecting any system or environment. It's also a good idea for us distributists to regularly touch grass, to ground ourselves in reality, and take some time to decompress, especially as we are bombarded with quite a lot of bad news on a very regular basis. If you want to go further than this and take an active role in becoming a steward of nature, I would definitely recommend joining your local nature volunteer group, as not only are you getting into a good cause, but it will also teach you a lot of new skills. If you're going to take anything away from this speech, please let it be to just go for a walk in your local nature reserve or forest. So how do you begin living distributistly in modern Britain? Generally, the first stages of living distributistly are the easiest. And the first step is to start sourcing your means of living as close to you as possible. Usually this comes in the form of where you buy your food, so switching out the supermarket for the butcher and the baker, etc. It could be buying artisan products from the farmer's market instead of Amazon. Choosing to move away from the industrial way of production, voting with your wallet, as some may call it, is a good start. This step is quite self-explanatory. Other ideas for this may be learning simple repair skills, so that could be your bike repair, sewing, basic electrics, and going to colleges to learn these skills. Personally, in the past few months, I've been quite influenced by a movement right now that's quite popular in sort of vintage communities, of just make, do and mend, and starting to repair your own clothes again, and encouraging you to start sewing specifically, so that we don't have all the fast fashion and we buy decent clothes that we ourselves can repair and keep going for a century. Other ideas are you could grow your own food. Even if you have a flat, herbs, tomatoes, mushrooms and microgreens can actually be grown in a flat. Tomatoes in particular, you can grow it in your windsill. Cooking at home more, and using local produce when you can. It's quite surprising when I speak to young people, especially on job sites nowadays, how many people don't know how to cook their own food. And I'll be completely frank and honest that in January, I also did not quite know how to cook my own food. It was one of those things that I learned from living alone. That was mainly learning how to make pretty basic poverty meals, but now it's actually learning how to cook hearty meals. And the value that it is given to my life in particular, and how I felt from January to now, there's been an immense difference. It is a skill that should be taught, but it's also something that you have to be willing to learn yourself. Living distributistly, I will say, becomes a lot harder when you decide it's time to take the plunge to try and live within your own means. On my distributist journey, I wrongly thought that being self-employed would be my way to achieve self-sufficiency. However, for me, it only served to tighten the chains around my feet. For those with an already polished craft, this could well be the direction to go in. However, for me, the route looks more akin to reducing how much I have to work in order to achieve a level of security, and then use the free time to pursue politics, writing, etc. For most, I imagine this will be the level where you begin to learn a craft, and begin your journey in becoming an artisan or skilled professional. You don't necessarily need to become an artisan to live a distributist life. If you work in an independent local company like a cafe or trade, you're still providing an important service to your community. You don't have to all leave this meeting and become blacksmiths if you don't want to. Step 3, and coming back full circle, is to work towards living deliberately and cultivating mindfulness. Thoreau isn't asking you to live in a cabin, he's asking you to live deliberately. We've discussed the reasons already for why this is important, so to end it, I will give you some ideas on how to achieve this. Although potentially extreme, you can remove anything physical, financial, social that clutters your ability to focus on living well. You can avoid debt where possible. That's a big one because it gives you a freedom to sort of do whatever you want. It's quite helpful. Limit passive consumption where possible. I would say this is easier when you can customize your own living space to your needs. For example, if you live home with your parents and they have a telly and internet, you can't just go and rip it out and chuck it out the window. Like I would love to, but in my own house I wouldn't have those things. And the final step on how to sort of cultivate living meaningfully, I think a lot of it can actually come from just simply reading regularly and furnishing your mind with beauty. That can be from prose, poetry, literature, and this can go back to, if you want to put it in an English distributist way, going back and reading sort of classic English literature is the first step to doing that, and then you can sort of switch around where you like. I'll end this speech with Thoreau's most famous quote, and anyone who has watched the film Dead Poets Society should immediately recognise it. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. And that's the end.